The first time I pulled up to her house, I didn't think twice about it. It was just another job on the calendar. A basic yard cleanup. A new client from a word-of-mouth referral to neighborhoods over. I'd gotten the address in a rushed voicemail. No details, no special requests, just her first name and an asking price that was a little above the going rate, which made me think either she was desperate or picky. Maybe both. The house was tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, older than the others but not falling apart. The kind of place that had been loved once, maybe a long time ago, then slowly neglected until the vines crawled where they shouldn't, and the grass began telling stories no one asked to hear. I remember the way the gate creaked when I pushed it open, like it hadn't been touched in months. And I remember the heat, the kind that makes the back of your neck itch, and your shirt cling to your spine before you've even started moving. I hadn't seen her at first. I just unloaded my mower, set up like I always do, and started with the perimeter to get a feel for the ground. It wasn't until I was halfway through the front yard, sweat dripping into my eyes, that I looked up and saw her standing on the porch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. If this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She wasn't doing anything, just watching, one hand holding a coffee mug, the other tucked into the pocket of a faded cardigan. Her face was calm, unreadable. Not the curious kind of stare most homeowners give you when you show up, but something quieter, almost analytical, like she was trying to decide if I was real. I gave her a nod, the kind you throw out when you're not sure if the person wants to talk, but she didn't nod back. She just kept watching, and I turned away before it got uncomfortable. I figured she was private, maybe cautious, maybe just one of those people who doesn't do small talk, which was fine by me. I finished the yard in under 2 hours mowed. Trimmed, bagged, swept the path, and when I came to the porch to tell her I was done, she was gone. I knocked once, no answer. I figured maybe she left or didn't hear me, so I took a few photos of the work, packed up, and got ready to leave. Just as I was pulling the truck door shut, she stepped back out. She looked different then. Not because she'd changed clothes or fixed her hair, but because there was something looser about her posture, like she'd come to a decision. She walked straight up to me and handed me an envelope. No words, just the envelope. I thanked her. It was about to turn when she said, softly but clearly, that the yard looked like it remembered how to breathe again. I smiled, unsure what to say to that, and she nodded like that was enough. Then she said, "It's you're the first man to see me at 48. Just like that. No warning, no context. Just a sentence, dropped like a match into dry grass. I didn't know what she meant. And maybe she could tell because she gave me this half smile. Not sad, not playful, just honest. Then she turned and walked back to the house. The screen door shut behind her, and I stood there for a long minute, staring at nothing. My hand still on the steering wheel, wondering what the hell she'd meant. I played the words over in my head the whole drive home. You're the first man to see me at 48? Was it a flirt? A confession? A warning? I couldn't tell. I didn't expect to hear from her again. Most clients rotate services every few weeks, and a lot don't even rebook. But 4 days later, she sent a text. No greeting, just the words, front and back this time, if you're free Friday. That was it. No emoji, no name, just the message. I stared at it longer than I should have, then typed back a simple confirmation and added her to the calendar. That Friday I went back. This time the gate didn't creak. She must have oiled it. The grass had grown again, not wildly, but enough to need taming. She didn't come out while I worked, but I felt her watching. There was no question about it. I didn't see her, but I felt her. Like she'd become a presence in the space. Not quite haunting, but definitely hovering. The way you feel someone looking at a photo of you that you forgot they had. I finished. The front moved to the back and found it even more overgrown, patches of earth gone soft. Edges of garden beds swallowed by weeds, trees bending into the space like they were trying to speak. I took my time, trimmed around the edges, reshaped what I could without instructions. It felt like sculpting more than yard work. When I was done, I knocked on the back door. She opened it without delay this time, and for the first time, she smiled. Not wide, not bright, but real. There were lines around her eyes that only show up when someone smiles like they mean it. She thanked me, told me it looked like it used to before. I asked before what, but she just said before and left it at that. I didn't press, I wasn't there to dig. I was just the guy who mowed the lawn. Still the way she said it, something. And my chest tightened. Like maybe she wasn't talking about the yard at all? I got back in my truck and drove off, but the whole time her words circled me like smoke. You're the first man to see me at 48. It wasn't romantic, I was sure of that now. It was something else, something heavier. The kind of thing someone says when they've gone invisible for a long time, not because they wanted to, but because the world stopped looking. Maybe I was just the guy who pushed a mower back and forth across her lawn. Or maybe I'd become something else without knowing it. I told myself I wasn't going to think about her, but of course, did. The problem with curiosity is, once it starts, it doesn't stop at convenient moments. It works its way into the cracks of your day, the pause between songs on the drive, the stretch of silence while you wait for the microwave, that lull before. Sleep where your thoughts drift into places they don't belong. That's where she lived now, just behind the noise, in the quiet folds of my mind. I hadn't even asked for her last name. She hadn't offered it. But she was there all the same, not just the image of her on that porch or the sound of her voice when she said that sentence, but something deeper, something I couldn't name yet. I told myself it was just the strangeness of the comment. That's all, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Like it was both a confession and a dare. She was handing me a key without telling me where the lock was. She texted again a week later. No greeting, just, "Yard needs you again. You free Thursday?" It was always like that, short, efficient, stripped of anything soft. But there was something oddly personal in her brevity. As if she'd trimmed all her language down over the years to protect herself from being misunderstood. I texted back, yes, and when Thursday came, I pulled up to the house with a tension I hadn't expected. The work hadn't changed. The yard still needed shaping. The weeds still whispered beneath the hedges, but I was different. I was paying attention now, to the edges, to the feeling in the air, to the pauses in my own breath. And as soon as I stepped onto the property, I felt it again, that presence. Not always visible, but undeniable. Like the house itself was holding its breath. This time, she didn't wait until I was halfway through. She was already on the porch when I arrived, a sweater draped over her shoulders despite the rising heat. She didn't wave, didn't speak. Just nodded once before stepping inside, like she'd checked that I showed up, and that was enough. I got to work. The grass wasn't long, but it was wild, like it had taken offense at being tamed, and now grew with spite. There was a tree limb that had fallen during the last storm, wedged awkwardly across the fence line. I dragged it to the curb, took my time looping through the overgrown back flower bed that I'd been avoiding until now. As I trimmed, I noticed things I hadn't seen before: small ceramic owl tucked into the soil behind the roses, a wind chime made of spoons that didn't chime anymore, a child's chair half buried near the tree roots. They were quiet artifacts of a life that had once been louder, scattered clues she hadn't bothered to hide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I finished, I knocked on the back door again. This time she answered quickly, like she'd been standing nearby. She handed me another envelope, and I asked her how she'd been. She shrugged and said, "Better now." Then paused, like she hadn't meant to say that much. She glanced out at the yard, scanning it with those eyes that always seemed to be calculating something you couldn't see. Then she said the strangest thing, that sometimes it took another person's hands to remind you what care looked like. I didn't know if she was talking about the lawn or something else, and I didn't ask. I nodded, said I was glad it helped, and turned to leave. But just as I reached the steps, she asked me if I had plans next week. I stopped, said I didn't. She told me the back gate was rusting and needed oil, and the rose bushes hadn't been cut in years and might need real pruning, not just cleanup. It wasn't a request, not exactly. More like an offering. Like she was building a bridge, one board at a time, and waiting to see if I'd keep walking forward. I said I'd come by Tuesday. She nodded again, but this time her eyes lingered. Just a second longer than necessary. Long enough to make me wonder if she'd always been this alone, or if I was just catching her during a season of it. When I left, I didn't drive straight home. I stopped at a hardware store, picked up a small can of oil, some gardening gloves, a pair of pruning shears. I didn't tell myself why. I didn't need to. The answer had already started to take shape somewhere. Under my ribs. When Tuesday came, I was there early. The gate didn't creak when I opened it, but only because I'd oiled it before knocking on her door. I started in the back this time, working through the flower beds, pulling weeds with more attention than usual, pruning the roses with deliberate, careful snips. It was quiet. Birds overhead whined through the trees, the faint clink of something. Inside the house, halfway through I looked up and saw her at the window, not hiding, just watching. Her face was unreadable again, but softer this time. When I finished, I knocked, and she opened the door already holding a glass of water. Not for her, for me. She offered it without a word, and I took it without speaking. Something in the air shifted, then not loudly, not obviously, but like a hinge that had finally loosened after years of rust. I asked her how long she'd lived there. She said 21 years. I asked if she'd always done the yard work herself. She said no, then added, not since he left. I didn't ask who he was. Didn't need to. Her voice had gone brittle at the edges. I sipped the water, nodded slowly, and said it looked better now. She looked up at me and said, "So do I." I didn't know what to say after that. I just stood there, holding the empty glass, watching a woman who had clearly spent years building a world where no one could see the parts of her that had cracked quietly, without drama, without witnesses. But somehow, that day, she let me see. Just a little. And maybe that was enough. It became a kind of unspoken ritual. Every Tuesday morning, I'd show up before the sun fully settled in, and she would already have the side gate unlocked. I never asked for it, and she never told me she'd done it, but it was always ready. I'd park in the same spot, haul out my gear, and make my way to the backyard like I belonged there. Rarely greeted me when I arrived, but I could sense her moving inside the house, sometimes behind the curtains, sometimes visible just for a second through the kitchen window, a silhouette in motion. I got used to it. The rhythm, the presence, the feeling of being watched, but not in a way that made me shrink. It was strange, almost comforting, like I was being trusted to touch something no one else had been near for a long time, and it wasn't. About the yard. I knew that now. The more I worked, the clearer it became. This was about something else entirely. The yard was just the excuse. What she was really giving me was time. Her space, her silence. And in that silence, stories started to slip through in pieces, like light leaking through shutters. I found the journal under the bench by accident. I wasn't snooping. I had dropped my phone behind one of the potted plants near the back fence. And when I reached for it, my fingers brushed against the soft, worn cover of something that clearly hadn't been moved in a while. I pulled it out without thinking, not even sure what it was at first until I saw the pages. The loops of handwriting, the ink that had bled slightly from moisture or time. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I set it gently back down, careful, to place the bench leg where it had been so it would hide the cover like before. But that moment stayed with me. Not because I wanted to know what was inside, but because I realized that she still kept parts of herself buried even on the land she lived alone. She wasn't someone who spilled icily. She was someone who stored. The more time I spent there, the more I noticed the little Tels photos on the walls in the hallway, just slightly turned away from direct light, frames that had clearly been dusted recently despite their age. A necklace hanging on a hook by the door that looked like it hadn't been worn in years. An empty planter on the windowsill with soil that had gone dry but hadn't yet been discarded. Everything in her house looked like it had a past tense. Even the furniture seemed like it had been inherited from a version of her life she no longer spoke to. But she kept it all. Not because she couldn't let go, but because letting go would mean acknowledging what had never returned. To wonder more and more about what she meant that first day when she said, "I was the first man to see her at 48. It wasn't flirty. It wasn't sad. It was a statement layered in something older than desire. It was about being seen, not glanced at, not measured, not categorized, but actually seen. And it hit me that maybe she hadn't meant I was the first one since 48. Maybe she meant ever. She started leaving things for me's, fall things. That felt enormous in their intent. A cup of water on the porch before I arrived, slice of lemon loaf on a napkin next to my tools. One day, it was a book of poetry with a bookmark on a folded page. Another time, it was a thermos of coffee with a label that read strong, like you. Each one said nothing and everything all at once. She didn't need to explain. I didn't need to ask. The care was there, folded inside the simplicity. She was learning to trust me in her own language, and I was learning to hear it. One Tuesday I lingered longer than usual. The work had been done hours before, but I found myself dragging out the final tasks, sweeping slower, checking corners twice, rearranging tools like I didn't know where they went. She noticed, of course she did. She came outside, not with a question, but with an extra chair. She set it down next to mine beneath the old tree in the corner of the yard, and sat without a word. We didn't talk for a long time. The birds were louder than us, and the wind carried just enough weight to move the branches without making it feel cold. When she did speak, it came out like an apology and a confession braided into one. She said she used to host dinners here, at the tree, had once been wrapped in lights. That laughter had filled the backyard and the walls and the rooms, and now it didn't. She didn't say why, but the silence afterward was thick enough to tell me whatever ended had done so in a way that scorched the roots, not just the branches. I told her it was a beautiful yard, that it still felt like something good had happened here. She looked at me for a long time, like she wasn't used to people disagreeing with her grief. Then she said, "I used to be someone else." And for the first time I understood what she meant. Not just that time had changed her, but that she had buried parts of herself so deeply that even she couldn't reach them without help. And maybe what she was really saying was that I'd come along not to fix it or dig it up, but to make it okay for her to even look again. When I left that day, she walked me to the gate. She didn't say goodbye. She just stood there, her fingers grazing the rusted edge, her eyes steady. And in that moment, something passed between us, unspoken but solid. A quiet agreement. I'd keep coming back. She'd keep letting me. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to bring something back to life, not with fanfare, but with presence. The day she invited me inside was colder than the others. The first real sign that summer was loosening its grip on the air. There had been a windstorm the night before that scattered leaves across the yard like confetti from a party no one attended. And I showed up earlier than usual to clear it all before the afternoon sun made the work unbearable. The gate, as always, was already unlocked. Now the backyard looked like it had been shaken in its sleep. Branches bent, planters tipped slightly, soil splattered across the brick path like ink stains. I started with the blower, then raked, then swept, falling into a rhythm that had become second nature. She didn't appear in the window that time. No watching, no presence. Just the yard and the wind in me. It wasn't until I was wrapping up that I heard the door open behind me. Not fast, not hesitant, just intentional. When I turned, she was standing there with a soft gray shawl around her shoulders and a mug cupped in both hands. Her hair was pulled back loosely, like she hadn't intended to see anyone that day and didn't care if she did. She didn't say much, just asked if I wanted a break. I said sure, and she gestured toward the house with the slightest nod of her chin. I left my gloves on the bench and followed. Inside, the house smelled like something warm had lived there. Recently cinnamon, maybe nutmeg, or just the lingering memory of something baked. The floors were old hardwood, the kind that creaks in specific spots, and the hallway walls were lined with photos that had clearly been in those frames for decades. She led me to the kitchen and handed me a second mug, then motioned for me to sit at the small table in the corner. It looked out over the yard, the same one I'd been taming week by week. From this angle, the garden beds looked more organized, the trees less tired, the grass almost proud of itself. I took a sip and tried to act normal, even though nothing about being inside felt casual. It wasn't just the shift in setting, it was the shift in tone. Outside, there had been space, silence, distance. Inside, the air was closer. The walls held history, and I could feel the presence of her life around me in a way that made me sit straighter in my chair without realizing it. She moved slowly through the kitchen, not to clean or cook, but like she was reacquainting herself with the space while someone else occupied it. I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the counter, the way she glanced at the window like it had something to say. There were no words between us for a while, just the quiet sound of 2 mugs being set down and picked up and set down again. Then she sat across from me and looked out the window, not at me, not yet, and said she used to host Thanksgiving here. The table would be extended with a leaf, the chairs mismatched, the food slightly too salty, always too much. Oh. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't say who came to those dinners or when they stopped, but the silence afterward told me it had been a long time. She said she almost donated the extra chairs last year, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Not because she thought they'd be used again, because part of her needed the reminder that the room once had more sound. I looked around the house then, not as a guest, but as someone seeing a timeline in objects. There were signs of the life she once lived tucked into every corner. Books stacked next to candles that had long since burned out. A calendar from 2 years ago, still hanging by the fridge with dates circled in faded red ink. A bulletin board with a postcard pinned next to a recipe that had yellowed at the edges. She didn't decorate for show. She lived among artifacts. Everything had been placed once with intention, then left there as if time had paused the day. The sound left. I asked her if she missed it, not the noise, but the chaos. She said she missed being part of something that required her, not because she liked being needed, but because it gave her shape. And ever since she lost that shape, she hadn't known how to fill the space she left behind. Then, as if remembering I was still a stranger, she shook her head gently and stood to refill the mugs. I didn't offer to help. I knew better now. Meredith wasn't the kind of woman who wanted to be rescued or fixed. She just wanted someone to exist with her in the quiet without trying to rename it. So I stayed. I listened. I let the moment be what it was. When she sat back down, she asked me a question I didn't expect. She asked if I ever felt like I showed up to someone else's life and accidentally stayed too long. I told her I used to think I didn't stay long enough, that I'd learned how to be good at leaving before anyone noticed I was still there. She smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because I think it made her feel less alone. That day, I stayed longer than I should have. Not because I didn't have other things to do, but because she'd opened a door I hadn't even knocked on, and I didn't want to close it too quickly. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door and didn't open it right away. She looked at me and said, "The house didn't feel so still with you in it." Then she thanked me, not for the yard, but for the time. And when I stepped outside, the wind had died down. The trees stood taller. And something in me felt like I'd been invited into a kind of stillness that most people are too busy to notice, let alone honor. The next time I came by, she was already in the backyard, standing near the rose bushes with a pair of gloves on and a pair of shears dangling loosely from one hand. She looked like someone who had started a task, but forgotten why. Her body in the yard, but her mind floating somewhere far behind her eyes. She didn't wave, didn't speak, just nodded. Once, as I passed through the gate, and then turned her attention back to the bush in front of her, I watched her for a moment before unpacking my gear. She moved slowly, deliberately, clipping one branch, then pausing, like she was editing the past one snip at a time. The sky was overcast, and there was a faint coolness in the air that suggested autumn was starting to clear its throat. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel heavier, like even the wind was carrying memories instead of air. I started with the hedges, but I kept my eye on her, not out of concern but curiosity. She looked like a woman who was standing at the edge of something invisible, something only she could see. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I should stay quiet or step into it. Eventually, she sat down on the bench near the tree, still wearing the gloves. one hand resting on her knee like it had forgotten how to relax. I finished what I was doing and walked over, not expecting an invitation, but not waiting for one either. She looked up as I approached, and this time, she didn't nod. She just moved slightly, just enough to make room for me. That was all the permission I needed. I sat beside her in silence, and for a long time, we just stared out at the yard. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, like the space between waves. Then, without warning, she said something that changed the way I saw everything that had come before. She said the last time she'd sat on this bench with someone, it was a Tuesday and it was raining, and she'd asked her husband if he still saw her, and he said no, just like that. No explanation, no drama, just the truth dropped on her lap like a stone she hadn't asked to carry. She said he left 3 days later, packed 2 bags, took the car, and disappeared into another version of life. That didn't include her. No affair, no blowout fight, just exit. And she stayed. Not because she didn't have options, but because she didn't know how to move when everything inside her had gone still. She said for the first year she didn't speak much. Not out of grief, but because no one was asking her anything worth answering. Her friends stopped calling. Not all at once, but slowly, like they were waiting for her to stop being sad so they could return to whatever conversations they used to have. She said she let the house go, not on purpose, but because care had always been something she shared. She cooked less, cleaned less, laughed never. And over time, the silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like armor. She wore it until it became skin. And then one day she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the face looking back at her. Not because it had aged, but because it no longer reflected anything she knew how to love. That's when she stopped letting people in. No dating, no company. Just the yard, the walls, the carefully controlled routines that made her feel like she still existed. And then she said it again, "You're the first man to see me at 48. But this time she added something else. She said, "You're also the first one I've let see me since he stopped trying." And that hit me harder than I expected. Because I realized then that this wasn't about me. Not really. I was just the first one who stayed long enough, quiet enough, gentle enough to let her remember that she hadn't disappeared completely. I didn't try to comfort her. I didn't reach out or offer words she hadn't asked for. I just sat there, breathing beside her, letting the silence wrap around us like a blanket that belonged to both of us now. After a while, she took off her gloves and set them on the bench. Her hands were red from the chill and a little dirt smudged, and she looked down at them like she wasn't sure whose they were. Then she said the thing that broke me wide open. She said, "I thought I was safe when no one saw me, but I think maybe I was just invisible, and now I don't know how to be seen without feeling like I'm in danger." I wanted to say I understood. I wanted to tell her that I'd felt that way too, more than once. That there were years of my life where I measured my worth by how well I could hide in plain sight. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded slowly, like someone being handed a story they didn't earn, but had been trusted with anyway. That day I stayed even after the work was done. We didn't talk much more. She made us tea, and we drank it at the kitchen table while the light shifted through the windows in the wind. Pressed gently against the glass, there was no music, no phone buzzing, no distractions. It's just 2 people, sharing space in a house that had forgotten what it felt like to be filled. And for the first time I realized I wasn't just showing up to do a job anymore. I was part of something else now, something quiet, something brave, something slowly coming back to life. The following week felt different from the moment I stepped through the gate. The air had changed, not just in temperature, but in tone. Like something unspoken had settled between us during those quiet tea moments and was now stretching its legs. I noticed it in the way the chairs on the porch were angled, slightly toward each other, like they'd been used for a conversation that continued after I left. I noticed it in the way she'd swept the leaves off the steps herself, something she never did, like she was preparing the space before I even arrived. These weren't big things. They were quiet, almost invisible, but they carried weight. I felt it in my chest as I unloaded my gear. This subtle awareness that whatever was growing between us had passed some invisible checkpoint. Nothing. had been said, no boundaries broken. But something had shifted, and we were both pretending not to notice, while also noticing everything. She was already in the backyard again, this time with a rake in hand, wearing a faded denim jacket and her hair tied back in a loose knot that looked more intentional than she probably meant it to.
Ow.
She didn't wave, didn't greet me with words, but she looked at me a second longer than necessary when I walked by. That's all it took, just that 1 second. That's how quiet tension starts. I worked slowly, more aware of my movements than I wanted to be, trying not to look over too, often while also tracking every time she shifted her position. She didn't say much, but her presence was louder than usual, filling the space in a way that made it hard to focus. I'd look up and she'd already be watching me, but never startled, never embarrassed, like she wanted me to know, like she wanted to be seen now that she'd said the words out loud and survived the silence that followed. She came over while I was trimming the hedges and handed me a bottle of water, her fingers brushing mine just barely, but long enough that it didn't feel like an accident. I said thank you, and she stood there for a moment, like she had something to add, something just on the edge of her tongue. But then she stepped back, turned, and returned to raking without saying a word. I watched her go, and for a second, I felt something unfamiliar move through me, not lust, not even longing, but permission. Like she was giving me the green light to feel something I hadn't let myself feel until that moment. But I didn't act on it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what we had was still made of glass, still fragile, still dependent on the trust we were building quietly, week after week. When we finished the yard, she didn't offer tea. She asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. Caught me off guard. She said it so casually, like it wasn't a big deal, but her eyes didn't match the tone. Her eyes were holding their breath. I said yes without hesitating. Not because I was hungry, but because I knew this wasn't about food. This was about crossing another threshold. We ate in the kitchen, plates set out with care but not ceremony. She'd made soup, nothing fancy, but made from scratch, with herbs and bread and the kind of detail that told me she'd planned this in her mind before asking. We didn't talk much during the meal. The clink of the spoon, the sound of the clock, the occasional scrape of a chair. It felt like being in a museum where every sound echoed and everything meant something. She asked me about my family for the first time, and I told her more than I thought I would. About my dad's silence. About how I'd moved away not because I had to, but because I didn't know how to stay. She listened with the kind of attention that made you tell the truth before you even knew you were saying it. After we ate, we lingered. The dishes stayed in the sink. The lights stayed dim. She sat across from me with one leg tucked underneath, her and her fingers wrapped around a second cup of tea, and when our eyes met, neither of us looked away. That was the moment. The one where everything could have changed. The kind of moment that, in another story, would have ended in a kiss or a line of dialogue meant to break the tension. But we didn't move. Neither of us leaned forward. We just sat there, breathing in the weight of everything unspoken, aware that the energy between us had shifted from familiar to something else entirely. And the fear in both of us wasn't about what might happen. It was about what might be lost if we moved too fast. This wasn't about lust. This was about resurrection. About someone who had been buried under silence and routine slowly stepping back into her own skin. About someone who had stopped rushing, finally realizing the value of stillness. When I left that night, she walked me to the door and stood just a little too close when I said goodbye. Her arms were crossed, but not in a defensive way, more like she didn't trust them not to reach. I thought about touching her shoulder, her hand, something simple, but I didn't. Instead, I said I'd see her next week. She smiled, small and real, and nodded once before closing the door gently behind me. I stood on her porch for a moment afterward, just breathing, feeling the cool night air settle into my collar, my chest tight with something I didn't want to name yet. I didn't want to call it desire. I didn't want to call it love. I just wanted to call it real, and it was. It was the most real thing I'd felt in a long time. And I knew, then whatever this was, whatever we were building it, had already changed me. The following Tuesday came with a kind of stillness, that didn't belong to weather. The sky was clear, the air crisp, but the silence that wrapped around. The yard wasn't the ordinary kind. It felt intentional, like something had been paused between us, and neither of us had yet found the words to hit play again. I arrived early, earlier than usual, half hoping she'd be on the porch again, half afraid she would be, but the porch was empty. The windows were closed. There were no tools laid out, no rake against the fence, just the yard waiting. I started working without going to the door. The grass didn't need much, but I gave it more time than it deserved. Dragging out each task like stretching minutes would help me figure out what I was supposed to say if she did come out. Every now and then I caught myself glancing toward the kitchen window, the same one where I'd seen her watching before, but it stayed empty. The quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like something gathering, the breath before a song begins. It made me slower, more cautious, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to step wrong. Whatever this thing between us was becoming, it felt fragile. Like a butterfly you coax into your hand that will fly away if your breath gets too loud. It wasn't until I finished trimming the hedges that I heard the door open and saw her step. Outside, she wasn't carrying anything this time. No mug, no gloves, no reason. She just stood there for a second, looking at me like she hadn't decided whether she wanted to keep the distance or close it. Then she walked toward me. Not slow, not fast, just steady, like her body had made the decision before her mind did. She didn't ask how the yard looked. She didn't comment on the weather. She just asked me to walk with her, and without thinking, I wiped my hands on my jeans and followed. We walked past the garden, past the old tree, to a corner of the property I hadn't been to, yet a small alcove between the back fence and a tall hedge that curved inward, creating a kind of private nook where the sun broke through in streaks. There was a bench there, half covered in leaves, with chipped paint and one leg slightly crooked. She sat first, brushing the seat with her hand, and I joined her, careful not to crowd the space. She didn't speak at first, just breathed, like she was waiting for her voice to catch up with her body. Then she told me she'd been thinking about something I said weeks ago about hiding in plain sight, about leaving before anyone noticed. She said it stuck with her, not because it was poetic, but because she'd realized she'd done the opposite. She'd stayed too long in places where no one was really looking. And now that someone was, she didn't know what to do with it. She said she'd forgotten what it felt like to want something. Not just physically, but emotionally. That for so long her focus had been on survival, not desire. On routines, not dreams. And now here she was, sitting in a corner of her own yard, next to a man who hadn't asked for anything but kept showing up anyway, and it scared her more than being alone ever had. I listened without trying to shape her words into a path forward. She wasn't looking for answers. She was excavating something, digging out truths she hadn't spoken aloud in years. She said there were mornings she looked in the mirror and tried to remember what she used to like about her own reflection. She'd stopped wearing lipstick because it felt dishonest. That she hadn't bought new clothes in over 2 years because the idea of dressing for herself seemed pointless when no one was watching. She said when her husband left, it didn't break her heart. He broke her sense of scale. That she had spent years calibrating her worth to his attention, and when it disappeared, so did the mirror. She said she didn't miss him, but she missed being someone who believed she could be wanted. And then she said it again, softer this time, almost to herself, "You're the first man to see me at 48. But now I understand what that means. She wasn't saying it with pain anymore. She was saying it with clarity, with weight. The kind of realization that closes one door completely so another one can creak open just a little more. I looked at her, and she met my eyes, and there was a question there she hadn't asked yet. One I wasn't sure she even knew how to form. It wasn't about what I wanted. It was about whether I saw her as someone who was allowed to want. Whether I saw her as desirable, not out of politeness or pity, but from presence. From being here. From witnessing her as she was, not who she used to be. And the truth hit me all at once. I did. I wanted her. It's not in a reckless, urgent way, but in a way that felt earned. It's like I'd spent every Tuesday collecting pieces of her until I could finally see the full picture, and what I saw wasn't broken or faded. It was whole. It was vivid. It was real. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Instead, I told her that presence doesn't ask for proof, that sometimes wanting is enough. That she didn't have to perform youth or reinvent herself to be worthy of this moment. She closed her eyes and let the wind move through her hair, and I stayed beside her, hands resting on my knees, heart beating harder than it should have been. The moment passed slowly, gently, and when it was over, she opened her eyes and stood. She didn't say anything else. She walked back to the house with measured steps, leaving me on the bench in that hidden corner of the yard, sitting. In the echo of everything we hadn't dared name, when I finally left, the sun was beginning to dip low behind the rooflines. I didn't knock on the door to say goodbye. I didn't need to. I knew she'd felt the moment too. I knew she'd heard everything I hadn't said. The gate clicked behind me with its usual soft resistance, and as I walked back to the truck, I realized I wasn't just thinking about her anymore. I was waiting for the next time. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted it. Maybe that was the most important shift of all. There are moments you don't plan that end up defining everything. The next Tuesday started like every other quiet morning. Gear in the truck bed. Boots caked with last week's dust. A thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm by the time I reached her street. The gate wasn't just unlocked. That date was open. A small thing, but to me, it said something. She wasn't just waiting for me to enter. She was letting me in. That the hesitation was softening, turning into a kind of trust that didn't need to be named aloud. I stepped into the yard and immediately noticed she'd cleared some of the branches I usually handled first. She'd been out there, working before I arrived. It wasn't the kind of chore people did to save time. It was the kind you do when you know someone else will see it, and you want them to know you thought of them. It was effort dressed in silence. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I just began with the back garden, pulling weeds that had sprouted around the stone border. She appeared after half an hour, walking out slowly, wiping her hands on a towel tucked into the waist of her jeans. Her eyes already on me, before I looked up. She joined me without a word, kneeling near the opposite side of the flower bed. For a long time, the only sound was the pull of roots and the quiet rustle of leaves tossed into a pile. Her presence didn't make the work faster, but it made it fuller, richer, like we were tending to something more than just soil. I handed her a small trowel when she reached for a stubborn weed, and our fingers brushed, but she didn't pull back this time. She held the touch for half a breath, enough for it to land, enough for it to stay with me even after she turned her attention back to the dirt. What? It was the smallest gesture, but it shifted something. Like a rope pulled just one knot tighter. Like the silence between us was no longer empty space, but a bridge we were building together, slowly, plank by plank. After we finished the beds, she suggested we take a break under the tree, the one where I'd first seen her sitting with gloves on, pretending to prune while hiding behind the safety of motion. She brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, already sweating from the cold, and we sat on the bench without the usual buffer of distance between us. Her shoulder was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off her, but we didn't touch. Not yet. We talked about nothing, important recipes we both forgot halfway through. The odd colors of autumn creeping in early. Strange way the body begins to resist you once you pass 40, or in my case, 35. She laughed at that, and it wasn't the kind of laugh that breaks tension. It was the kind that says, I see you too. It was then that I looked over and found her already watching me. Not with curiosity this time, but with openness, willingness. The look of someone who had started asking herself a new question. What if I let this be easy? The conversation faded, but she didn't stand to leave. She stayed there beside me, looking out into her own yard, as if seeing it differently for the first time in years. I could feel her shifting in place slightly, not in discomfort, but in thought. Her fingers grazed her knee, then the bench, then stilled. And then gently, she placed her hand on top of mine. Not in invitation. In statement, I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just turned my palm upward to meet hers, and we sat there like that, hands folded loosely, the air between us quiet but electric. She didn't pull away. She didn't explain. And neither did I, because there was nothing to explain. This wasn't a seduction. It wasn't a decision. It was a beginning inside. A middle. It was her saying, I'm still here. It was me saying, I see you now, and I'm not going anywhere. That moment didn't turn into a kiss. It didn't become anything more than a hand held beneath a tree. But somehow, it meant more than anything else we'd shared. It was the first time the inside of her matched what she was willing to show on the outside. No guarded posture, no vague smiles. Just touch. Just presence. Just two people sitting in a yard that had become the backdrop for something neither of us had planned. When she finally let go, it wasn't because she was retreating. It was because she was ready. And when she stood, I stood too, and she looked at me with this softness I hadn't seen before. Like something in her had stopped bracing for the fall. She said nothing, just nodded toward the house, then toward the rake near the fence, and I understood. It wasn't time to talk about anything yet, but it was time to stay. We finished the work in near silence. Side by side, our movements slower, synchronized without speaking. When it came time to leave, she didn't walk me to the gate. She just watched from the porch, her arms loosely crossed, her body relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. I turned back once, just before reaching the sidewalk, and she raised her hand, not a wave, not goodbye, just acknowledgement, just I see you too. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't just showing up to do the yard. I was showing up for something far more fragile, far more precious. And so was she. The days between visits started to feel longer. Not because I was impatient, but because I was aware of her now in a way I hadn't been before. Aware of her movements. In memory, the sound of her voice lingering in my head, the feel of her hand resting in mine for that short but unshakable moment under the tree. Something had shifted, and we both knew it. Neither of us had spoken about it directly, but that touch had made the air between us different, charged, quieter, but heavier. I didn't know what she was thinking, and I didn't ask. But I also didn't try to push it forward. I knew this wasn't the kind of thing you rushed. This was healing, unfolding. And some things, if opened too quickly, never close right again. So I waited, and when Tuesday came, I showed up like I always did, early present, and quietly bracing for what might happen next. The yard looked neat, more maintained than usual, as if she'd been out there again on her own, tending to things. I used to be the first to notice. I wondered if it was a sign of independence, or maybe a sign she was trying to give me less work. Either way, it meant she was thinking about it, thinking about me, about us. She didn't meet me outside this time. I knocked on the back door, a soft habit I'd never really needed, and this time she answered right away. She didn't speak, just stepped aside to let me in. Her eyes weren't guarded, but there was something behind them. A flicker of uncertainty, maybe, or anticipation. She was wearing a soft sweater, the sleeves pulled over her wrists, and her hair was still damp, like she'd just showered. It was a kind of vulnerability she didn't try to disguise, and that alone said everything. She led me into the living room and motioned for me to sit. I did. The house felt warmer than usual, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, like it had been rearranged slightly to hold conversation rather than simply tolerate it. She disappeared for a moment, then returned with a small wooden box. She sat across from me and placed it between us, her fingers resting on the lid, and for a while, she just looked at it, not at me. Just the box, like it contained something volatile. When she finally opened it, the contents weren't shocking papers, photographs, scraps of handwriting. A necklace tangled in itself, but her body told me this was no small thing. She picked up a photo, held it loosely in her hand, and for the first time since we met, she said his name. It's not with anger, not with longing, just fact. The man who had been her husband, her mirror, her disappearance, she told me he had taken. More than just himself when he left. He had taken her certainty, her structure, the narrative she'd been writing since she was 24. And what remained was the box, the silence, the house, the yard. Right. All of it fragments, all of it hers. She handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a note. Not one he wrote, but one she had. was a letter to herself, scribbled 2 months. After he'd left, the handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged in places. It said things I couldn't believe she would show me. It said she wasn't sure she mattered anymore, that she had walked around the house 3 times one night just to see if she could feel anything. That she had stood in front of the bathroom mirror, said her name aloud, and waited for it to mean something again. She told me she had written it because she needed proof later. Proof that she'd made it through the worst. Proof that even if no one else saw her, she'd at least tried to see herself. When I handed the letter back, she didn't take it. Just pushed the box aside and looked at me looked at me with the kind of expression that comes from years of not being looked at. She said she wasn't showing me this for sympathy. She wasn't showing me this so I'd understand her. She was showing me because she needed to know what it felt like to let someone see the part of her that wasn't composed, wasn't poetic, wasn't brave. She said she was tired of being strong, that strength had become a performance, a routine, a cage. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to be strong. She just wanted to be real. She said she didn't need me to fix anything. She didn't want a savior. She wanted a witness. And if I couldn't do that, if I couldn't hold this truth without making it about myself, she'd understand, but she needed to know now, not later. After it got messier, I didn't say anything. I just moved from the chair to the floor in front of her, sat cross-legged and took her hand. It was cold, shaky, but it stayed in mine. I told her I didn't come here to save anyone. I came because something in her made the noise in my own life go quiet, because even in her silence, I felt more seen than I had in years. Wasn't afraid of the cracks, that I didn't think less of her for writing that note. I thought more. Because some people collapse quietly and no one ever knows. But she had documented the collapse. That to me was proof of her strength, not the armor she wore, but the act of remembering herself when no one else had. We didn't move for a long time. Her hand never left mine. The box stayed open on the table, her past visible, not hidden, not boxed up anymore. And when I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door without letting go. She held on until the last possible second, like something in her had finally landed, and she wasn't ready to let it drift again. As I stepped out onto the porch, the wind picked up, and she smiled not wide, but with her whole face. Like something had been lifted. Not all the way, but enough to breathe. And I knew then that the real intimacy wasn't going to be in a kiss or a bed or a confession. It was already happening. In that room, in that silence, in that trembling hand that hadn't let go. The morning. After she let me read the letter, I couldn't get her hands out of my mind. Not in a romantic way, but in the way they had trembled, just barely, when she gave me that piece of herself. It wasn't the letter that stayed with me, or the story of her being left, or even the photographs that looked like someone else's life. It was her hands strong enough to dig out roots, soft enough to hand me a glass of lemonade, steady enough to rake a yard into symmetry, but shaking when asked to be seen. That detail kept looping in my brain like a quiet reel. It made everything feel more fragile and somehow more permanent. The next Tuesday, I showed up not knowing what she would be like. Sometimes, when people open a door that wide, they rush to slam it shut again. The air in the yard felt dense, like the sky hadn't decided whether to rain or hold back. I paused at the gate longer than usual. But it was open again, waiting, and something about that felt like enough of an answer. She was in the back already, crouched by the flower bed, wearing that same faded jacket with the sleeves pulled over her hands. Even though the weather didn't demand it, I didn't call out. I just walked toward her quietly, like stepping into a space that didn't belong to me until I was invited. She looked up, not startled, not guarded, just aware. And she smiled, not big, but soft, like she was. Glad I was there and hadn't decided to run after holding what she gave me. That mattered. It counted. There are a million ways to measure connection, but one of the real ones is how a person looks at you the day after telling you something that could have scared you away. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask what I thought. She didn't try to smooth it over. She just started telling me how the roses were starting to shift out of season and needed to be trimmed back differently, I nodded, fell in beside her, and we began. We worked side by side that day, but closer than usual. Distance we used to keep without noticing had vanished, replaced with a kind of proximity that wasn't accidental. When she reached for tools, I handed them before she asked. When I moved to dig out an edge, she adjusted the soil like we'd practiced it. It was quiet, but not stiff. The silence was layered now, not with tension, but with knowing. We didn't need to fill it. Every movement said, I'm still here. Every shared glance said, you are too. After an hour, she brushed dirt from her hands and said she wanted to show me something. I followed her through the gate behind the shed, an area I hadn't been before, where ivy had started to reclaim a forgotten path. We walked slowly, stepping over roots and stones until we reached a small iron bench, almost completely hidden by a flowering tree that arched low like it was protecting something. She said she used to sit there every Saturday, just after sunrise, when the tree was in bloom and the birds were loud and the world was still too sleepy to interrupt. She said she hadn't been back there in years, that even after her husband left, she kept that bench like a shrine, but over time, it felt like sitting there meant admitting something had ended. So she stopped. I sat with her there for a long time. We didn't say anything about what the bench used to mean. We just let it be what it was. Now, quiet place, still here, still standing. She rested her hand on the edge, her fingers brushing the worn metal like she was reacquainting herself with a part of her she hadn't touched in a long time. I wanted to reach for her, but I didn't. Not because I was unsure, but because I didn't want to move too fast and make her flinch. I'd rather sit an inch away from something real than rush into something that cracks. When we stood to leave, she touched my back lightly, just between my shoulders, like she needed to anchor herself to the moment, and I let her. I didn't look back when we walked out of that garden path. Some spaces aren't meant to be stared at too long. They just need to be stepped through once more to remind you they still exist. Later, we sat in the kitchen with cups of tea. She'd stopped offering coffee, said she preferred how tea cooled slowly, said it gave her time to think. I could tell she was still in that space, the space between exposing something and seeing what comes of it. That week, she didn't hand it me anything personal, no letter, no photo. But what she did give me was still a gift. She asked me about fear. Not mine, not directly, just the concept. She asked if I thought it ever really went away, or if we just built a life big enough around it that we stopped bumping into it every day. I told her I thought fear never left. It just changed shape. It went from loud to quiet. Wait. And the people who really saw you really held, you weren't the ones who took it away, but the ones who made it okay to carry. She looked at me then, full-on, like she was scanning my face for something she couldn't put into words. And for the first time, I let her. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I let her see whatever was there, and she did. She didn't flinch. When I left that afternoon, she walked me to the porch. The goodbye wasn't drawn out. She didn't linger. She didn't reach for my hand. But she looked at me like I was already coming back, like this was no longer temporary. Like something we hadn't named yet had already unpacked its bags and moved into the space between us. And the thing is, she was right. It was already coming. Back. Not just to the yard. Not just to her stories. But to her silence. To her presence. To whatever this was that we were building without plans, without maps, without scripts. I drove away with the windows down, the wind in my ears, her handprint, still warm on the center of my back, and I knew, more than ever before, that love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you stepped toward, slowly, without knowing exactly where your feet would land. And I was stepping. The next time I saw her, it wasn't a Tuesday. It was a Friday evening, unexpected, unplanned. She texted just 2 words, come early. No yard work waiting, no tools set out, no gloves or clippers or lawn bags. It was the first time she'd asked me to be there outside the rhythm we'd established, and something about that made me pay attention in a different way. When I pulled up, the sun was already low, casting that kind of golden haze over the yard that makes everything look softer, slower.
Ow.
The gate was open, the porch light was already on, and she was sitting on the steps barefoot, with a sweater pulled around her and her hair loose like she hadn't tried to make it presentable, and somehow that made her look even more herself. I approached quietly, and she looked up at me with this expression that held no tension, no apology, just calm. Like she had already rehearsed what she needed to say and had finally decided not to overthink the timing. She didn't stand, just moved over slightly, making room for me to sit beside her. I did, and we sat there in silence for a minute, listening to the birds quieting down for the night, the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, a dog barking somewhere too far away to matter. Then, with her voice low and steady, she told me that today was her anniversary, not of marriage, of leaving. It had been exactly 5 years since her husband had packed the bags and driven away. She didn't say it with bitterness, she said it like someone saying the date aloud so they could measure how far they'd come. She said for the first 2 years she marked the day with anger. For the third and fourth she ignored it. But this year, for some reason, she didn't feel dread. She felt ... open. Like something had finally cleared in her chest and made space for new air. She said she didn't want to be alone that evening. Not to be rescued, not to be comforted, just witnessed. So she called me. That broke something open and meant in a painful way. But in that way that happens when you realize someone has stopped bracing around you. I didn't speak for a while. I didn't need to. I just let the moment stretch between us, quiet and wide. Eventually she leaned her head against my shoulder, gently, slowly, like testing a foundation she wasn't sure had. Finished drying. I didn't move. I didn't shift. I just let her rest there, feeling the weight of her body relax into mine by degrees. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't loud. But it felt like a shift in gravity, like we'd moved from standing near something to standing inside it. The sun dipped lower, and we stayed like that, letting the last of the light pull shadows across the yard, letting time fold in on itself. She started talking again. This time, not about him, about her. About the years afterward. The mistakes she made, the people she let close out of fear and loneliness, not out of trust. She said none of it had been malicious, but none of it had been real either. She said she hadn't let anyone into the house since, not past the porch, not really, and that she didn't know what it meant that I was there now. But she knew it mattered. She knew it felt different. Told her it felt different to me, too. That nothing about this felt rushed or fragile in the wrong way. That the weight of it wasn't a burden, it was a choice. Her hand found mine again. Then, no hesitation this time. Her fingers laced into mine, and she held on like it was an anchor. Not a question. We stayed like that until the porch light buzzed to life automatically, casting a soft halo around us. She asked if I wanted to come in, not with tension, not as a test, but as an offering. I said yes. Not because I expected anything, but because I wanted to keep stepping toward whatever this was becoming. Inside, the house felt warmer than I remembered, not just temperature, but tone, like she'd moved the air around on purpose. There was a candle burning in the kitchen, something with cinnamon and vanilla and maybe something floral underneath. She made tea again. We sat at the same table, but everything about it felt different now. Not new, but awake. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't explain why the day mattered or what it had cost her. She just let me be there. And I was. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. She walked me to the door later, like she always did, but this time when she paused, she didn't just look at me. She stepped closer. Close enough that her breath touched my neck. Close enough that I could feel the energy between us swell, but not break. I thought maybe this was the moment she'd kiss me. But she didn't. She just reached up, brushed her fingers along my collar, and whispered thank you in a voice that sounded like a heartbeat. And then she stepped back, turned the knob, and let the door open just wide enough to let me go. As I walked to the truck, I realized my hands were still warm from hers, and the weight on my chest wasn't heavy, it was whole. This wasn't a beginning anymore. This was the middle, the part where you stop doubting if something is real and start asking how deep it can go. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't need to. What I did know was this: when a woman who has been invisible for years lets herself be seen, fully and without defense, you don't rush that. You stay. You breathe. You keep showing up, not to fix her, but to stand beside her. And I was standing. It was the first Tuesday after that Friday night, and something about the house already felt different. I couldn't name it, but I felt it before I even touched the gate. There was a shift in the air, not just in the smell of dry leaves or the weight of the clouds rolling overhead, but in the stillness itself. It no longer felt like I was entering someone else's solitude. It felt like I was being expected. There was no hesitation in my steps this time, no wondering if I'd be greeted or met with silence. I knew she'd be there. And I knew, without understanding how, that we had crossed a line that didn't need to be drawn to be real. We were no longer tiptoeing around the edges of something unnamed. We were inside it now, and it was real. She met me at the door, not in the yard. She opened it before I could knock, like she'd been standing just behind it, waiting for the sound. She looked at me with this calm expression, not eager, not tense, just quiet assurance. She was dressed simply, jeans and a loose black sweater, but it felt more like a uniform of comfort than an attempt to appear casual. She said she wanted to show me something before I started. I nodded, and she stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled of cedar and coffee. There was music playing low somewhere in the back, something instrumental, maybe piano, soft and barely noticeable, but enough to fill the silence. She walked ahead of me through the living room and up the stairs I hadn't been invited to climb before. Her steps were slow, not hesitant, but deliberate. Like she was guiding me toward something sacred and wasn't sure how it would land. At the top of the stairs was a hallway, dimly lit, with 3 doors. 2 were closed. One was open, just a crack. She paused at the one in the middle and turned the handle. She looked back at me before opening it fully, and in that look I saw the weight of what she was doing. This wasn't a tour. This wasn't casual. She was offering something. I needed to receive it with care. The door swung open with a whisper. The room was small, but warm. The walls were painted a pale shade of blue, and there was a soft yellow blanket folded at the end of the bed. The windows were shuttered, but the afternoon light pushed through in streaks. On the far wall, shelves lined with books and photographs, some upright, some leaning against one another. There was dust, but not neglect. Everything in that room had been left in place, like someone stepped out and never returned. But the space was kept alive by memory alone. She stepped inside and walked to the desk near the corner. Her fingers trailed across its surface, landing on a framed photo she didn't lift. I stayed near the door, not out of distance, but reverence. She said this used to be her son's room. The words hit the air like they'd been waiting for a place to land. She didn't look at me when she said it. She kept her eyes on the photo. Said he'd left for college 6 years ago and never really came back. Not because of anger, just because life took him somewhere else. She said he visited twice, maybe 3 times. That the last time he was here, they'd had coffee and talked about taxes and summer jobs, and nothing. Us! That felt like a mother and son should talk about when time is limited. And then she said she hadn't changed anything in the room because she didn't want to erase his presence. But now, for some reason, she wanted someone else to see it. It's not to clean it, not to update it, just to know it existed. It's just to acknowledge that part of her hadn't been abandoned, just paused. Waiting for permission to re-enter, I stepped into the room then, slowly, carefully. The air smelled like old books and sunlight on wood. I didn't touch anything. I didn't comment. I just let the space speak. There was a baseball glove on. The shelf, a stack of journals, a coffee mug with a faded college logo. All of it frozen, but not lifeless. I looked over at her, and she was watching me now, not with fear, but with something closer to hope. Like she wanted to know if I'd treat this part of her with the same gentleness I'd given the rest. I did. I told her it was a beautiful room, that it felt like someone still lived there, even if they didn't. And she nodded, quietly, like she needed to hear that out loud. We didn't stay long, maybe 5 minutes. But in those minutes, she gave me something deeper than a memory. She gave me context. She let me see not just the pain of being left, but the pride of having created a space that someone once called home. As we walked back down the stairs, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had just passed between us. She didn't need to explain the room. I didn't need to ask. Sometimes what matters most is that someone else has seen it with their own eyes and didn't look away. We returned to the kitchen, and she poured 2 glasses. Of water, no tea, no fanfare. Just a quiet return to the ordinary. But everything had changed. I could feel it in her body, the way she moved more freely now, the way she looked at me without scanning for reaction. We sat at the table again, our glasses between us, and she said it was the first time she'd been in that room with anyone else in almost 6 years. She said she didn't know what it meant, only that it felt like something she needed to do. I told her it meant she trusted me. She didn't reply. The answer was in her eyes. When I left that day, she walked me to the door as usual. This time, when I turned to say goodbye, she reached up and touched the side of my face, just once. A soft brush of fingers across my cheek. Then she stepped back, smiled, and closed the door behind her. It was the gentlest, loudest thing she'd done yet. And I felt it all the way home. That was the moment I knew we were no longer circling something. We were in it. Not naming it, not rushing it, but building it, quietly. One open room at a time. Following week, the weather turned. It wasn't the kind of change that announced itself with storms or cold snaps, but that slow, creeping shift in the air that tells you summer has quietly surrendered. The trees were starting to yellow at the edges, and the late afternoon sun had a different color to it, less gold, more amber. I noticed it as I turned onto her street, how the shadows clung longer to the houses, how the whole neighborhood seemed to inhale just a little deeper, like the world knew change was coming and wasn't sure whether to brace or welcome it. When I stepped through her gate, I noticed the ivy had crept higher on the far fence, almost daring her to care, and she had. It had been trimmed just slightly, not enough to erase it, but enough to suggest someone had said, "Not yet." She was. Already outside, sitting on that bench under the tree again, a blanket draped over her lap, one hand curled around a book she wasn't reading. She looked up when I approached, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not softness, but uncertainty, kind of quiet unrest. I sat next to her without asking. That had become our way now, no need for permission, just presence. She closed the book without marking the page, set it on her knee, and looked out toward the yard. Then, almost out of nowhere, she asked me if I ever felt like I was just borrowing time from something I hadn't earned. The question hit like a small stone thrown in a still pond. Not loud, but it rippled. I didn't answer right away. I waited, knowing she hadn't asked for my opinion, but for the space to think aloud. She said she didn't know what this is here now was supposed to be. That some days she felt like she was finally standing on her own 2 feet, not holding anything for anyone else. And that other days she felt like she was performing normal just to see if it might eventually feel like truth. And then she said something I didn't expect. She said she was afraid she was starting to want something again. Not the idea of companionship, not the comfort of not being alone, but me. She said she didn't know what to do with that it felt reckless, even though everything we'd done had been careful, that it felt dangerous, even though I hadn't done anything but show up. She looked at me then, not in fear, but in fragile honesty, and asked me what I wanted. In the future, not with conditions, just now. What did I want from her right now? And it was a question that split me open, because it came from a place so few people are brave enough to speak from. She wasn't asking me to define our relationship. She was asking if the version of her she'd shown was enough. And not just enough to keep my interest, but enough to be seen, chosen. Wanted not in spite of her age, her past, her silence, but because of it. I told her I wanted exactly what we were building. That I didn't need a label. I didn't need a plan. I needed this rhythm, this tenderness, this unspoken agreement to take each step together, even if we weren't sure where the path ended. I told her I wasn't afraid of her fear. Wasn't scared of the pauses, the moments she pulled back, or the days she'd want to hide. I understood that real love wasn't about perfect consistency. It was about showing up anyway. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just reached for my hand slowly and laced her fingers with mine like she was letting herself believe me. And in that silence, something inside her settled. Later, we moved inside, not because of the cold, but because the light was fading and neither of us wanted the conversation to end, just because the day was. We sat on the couch this time, something we'd never done before, the tea steeping in the background, forgotten on the stove. We didn't face each other, just sat side by side, staring at the far wall where one of her old photographs hung. Beach somewhere, maybe Maine, the kind of photo that doesn't demand attention until you really look at it. She told me it was the last trip they'd taken as a family, that she'd taken that photo just before everything shifted. She said sometimes she stared at it, not because she missed it, but because she wanted to remember that version of herself. A woman who felt like she belonged in the picture. And I told her I saw that version of her now, but I saw the woman behind the camera, not the shadows around the memory. And for the first time since I met her, she let out a laugh that was almost a sob, like she didn't know whether to hold on or let go. And that was when I knew this wasn't about romance. This was about resurrection. When I left that night, she walked me to the door again, but this time there was no pause, no lingering questions, no need for anything unsaid. She pressed her forehead lightly against mine for a moment before pulling away. It was such a small gesture, but it carried everything. I drove home that night without music, the windows down, the silence in my truck filled with everything we hadn't said. And I realized that love doesn't arrive in declarations or fireworks. It comes in layered silences, in offered rooms, in the trembling breath of someone finally deciding to risk being known again, and I had been there to witness it, to walk through it, to stay. It was the first time I arrived and found the gate locked again. After everything, the open doors, the quiet welcomes. The hour spent side by side in the house and yard in Memriette was such a small thing, but it hit me hard. I stood there for a second, hand resting on the latch, wondering if maybe I was early. Maybe she wasn't ready yet. Maybe I'd misread the timing. But deep down I knew this wasn't forgetfulness. This was distance. Reappearing. Something had shifted again, but this time not forward. I knocked once and waited. The curtains didn't move. No sound came from inside. After a long minute, the door finally creaked open and she stood there, not quite behind it, but not fully outside of it either. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that sinks into your bones when something inside you starts unraveling. Her face was pale, her eyes unreadable. She didn't smile. She just said that today wasn't a good day. And she hoped I understood. And then, just as quickly, she shut the door again. No invitation. No explanation. I didn't leave right away. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see if maybe she'd change her mind, open the door again. Step out and explain. But she didn't, and I didn't knock a second time. I drove home with this slow, growing ache in my chest. Not anger, not confusion. But the kind of ache that comes when you know someone has gone quiet, not to push you away, but because something inside them has gotten loud again. And the worst part was, I couldn't fix it. I couldn't mow it. I couldn't sweep it or tend to it or carry it for her. All I could do was wait, and that felt both helpless and holy at the same time. 3 days passed before she texted, 3 short words. I'm so sorry. I didn't ask questions. I just replied, I'm here. I didn't say anything else, because anything else would have been about me, and this wasn't. This was her battle, her relapse. Her wave. She called later that night. No small talk, just her voice, quiet and brittle. She told me her ex-husband had called out of nowhere, that he was passing through the city for work, that he wanted to meet for coffee. Just to talk, he'd said. Just to catch up. And something about hearing his voice on the line, hearing him say her name like it hadn't been years since he'd last used it, had thrown her completely off center. She said she'd said no, that she'd told him she wasn't available, but the damage had already been done. The floodgates had opened. Memories she thought she'd boxed up were spilling out. All the worst kinds, The ones that come disguised as good? The ones that make you question your progress, your choices, your worth. She said it wasn't that she missed him, it was that. She hated how quickly her body remembered what it felt like to be dismissed. That the call had made her feel 13 again in her own skin. Young, foolish, unsure, small. And that's what scared her. Not him, herself. She said she'd been doing so well, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was starting to want things again. Want moments, want presence, want someone. And that scared her even more than the call, because it meant she had something to lose now. She said she'd shut the door that day because she didn't trust herself not to spiral. Because she'd spent so long putting herself back together, she couldn't bear the thought of shattering in front of someone else, especially not me. And I told her I understood. That safety isn't a promise, it's a practice. That she didn't have to explain her fear to earn my understanding. That I didn't show up because she was strong every day. Showed up because I'd already seen what made her real. The next time I came by, the gate was open again. And she was waiting for me on the porch, barefoot, with a cup of coffee she didn't offer, just held between her hands like a tether. She looked tired still, but clearer, like she'd weathered something and made it through. She didn't say much, just asked me to walk with her. We didn't talk about the call. We didn't talk about the way her voice had cracked or the way mine had gone soft to meet it. We just walked through the yard, shoulder to shoulder, past the beds we'd planted, past the bench, back to the corner of the garden she hadn't touched in years. She told me she wanted to dig it out again, that she wasn't ready to fill it with new things just yet, but she didn't want it to stay dead either. So we knelt side by side, hands in soil, pulling out roots that had grown too deep, too wild, too long, without interruption. She looked at me then, dirt on her cheeks, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and said that she still didn't know what she was doing, that every day felt like new terrain, but that for the first time, she wasn't doing it alone, and that mattered. It changed things. And I nodded, because sometimes nodding is louder than saying I love you. Because love, in that moment, wasn't about the future. It was about the now, about showing up even when the door is locked, about understanding silence as another kind of invitation, about watching someone remember how to want a gained being, steady enough to let them come back when they're ready. I had never been the type to talk about myself. Not really. I was the helper, the steady hand, the one who showed up and got things done. I moved through people's lives quietly, left things a little better than I found them, and disappeared before anyone could ask what I needed in return. It wasn't heroic. It was strategic. It kept me out of the spotlight and gave me just enough meaning to make loneliness tolerable. But Meredith had changed something. Not quickly, not loudly, just consistently, with her silence, her stories, her invitations that didn't feel like demands. And now that she had let me all the way in past her past, past her fears, knew I couldn't keep holding mine like a secret I didn't know. She hadn't asked. She never would. But I owed her that part of me, if only because she'd already given me so much of hers without expecting anything in return. So the next time I came, I brought nothing with me. No tools, no gloves, no plans, just time. In truth, she was sitting on the porch again, reading the same book I'd seen her with before, only this time she looked up when I arrived and smiled without hesitation. It was a tired smile, but it was there. The kind that doesn't try to perform joy, just presence. I sat beside her without a word, and for a few minutes we just watched the light settle over the yard. Then I told her I had something to share, that it wasn't about her, that it wasn't easy. And she didn't say anything. She just set the book down and turned her body slightly toward me. Not leaning in, but bracing for weight. I told her about my brother, about how we used to be close, inseparable, to kids in the same sinking boat. Rowing hard in opposite directions, but always landing near each other somehow. I told her how we'd grown up in a house with no softness, where silence was the only thing ever offered when you cried. And how we learned to carry pain like furniture, heavy but expected, something you just moved around and never threw out. Told her how he'd gotten into trouble in his 20s, how I'd tried to help, how I loaned him money. Let him crash on my couch, covered for him more times than I could count. And then one day he disappeared. Left a voicemail. Said he needed space. Said he'd be in touch. That was 7 years ago. No address, no number that worked, no idea where he went. I'd spent the first year angry, the second year scared, the third year convinced I'd done something to make him run. After that, I just stopped thinking about it out loud. I packed the grief into the walls of my routine, let it settle into the background like white noise. I told her I still check my email every morning, hoping for a message from a name I haven't said out loud in years. Sometimes I see someone in a crowd with his walk, his posture, and I have to sit down to breathe. I told her that I don't hate him. I just miss him. I don't even know who I'm missing anymore. When I finished, she didn't reach for me. She didn't try to soften the ache. She just sat there and absorbed it like it was hers too. And that did something to me. It made the pain feel less lonely, less abstract, more like a scar I could name without shame. She told me that loss comes in waves, even when the person is still technically alive. That it's okay to grieve a version of someone who doesn't exist anymore, and that maybe the strongest thing you can do is keep space for them in your heart. Without letting them take up all the room, we didn't say much after that. There wasn't anything left to say. We just sat close, knees touching, breathing in the kind of silence that doesn't sting. That night, she asked me if I wanted to stay for dinner, and I did. But this time it wasn't a gesture of politeness. It was a request. She'd made soup again, something simple, something warm. We ate at the kitchen table with the windows open, the breeze carrying in the smell of soil and fallen leaves. Lit a candle even though the power was on, and it made the room feel smaller in a good way. Intimate, sacred. After we ate, we sat in the living room, neither of us pretending to be interested in the book she picked up or the music that played. Softly in the background, I asked if she still wrote letters to herself like the one she'd once let me read. She said no, she didn't need to anymore. Because now, someone else was listening, and I realized then that this was what real intimacy looked like. Not declarations, not heat, but being willing to show someone the parts of yourself you usually apologize for. And them saying, no apology necessary, I see you, and I'm still here. That night when I left, she didn't walk me to the door. I kissed her on the forehead before I stepped outside, and she smiled at me through the screen door as I backed. Down the steps. Nothing more, nothing less. Just presence. Just a people who'd stopped trying to be impressive and started being true. And for the first time in years, I drove home feeling like someone knew who I was beneath the silence, and chose to stay. The next Tuesday began like any other, but something in the wind was different. It was sharp, not in temperature but in edge. The kind of wind that carries with it a warning rather than a breeze. I pulled up to Meredith's house with the usual sense of quiet anticipation that had grown into habit. But the moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt it. That low-frequency tension humming under the surface. The kind you can't name yet, but your body registers long before your brain catches up. The gate was shut, but not locked. The porch light was off. Blinds that usually stayed open in the kitchen were drawn. Subtle things, tiny shifts, but they added up. I walked to the front door instead of going around back, and when I knocked, I heard voices inside. Two, hers and a man's. Low, calm. Familiar in a way that made me immediately uneasy. I stepped back instinctively, like I'd arrived at the wrong house, or the wrong moment in someone else's story. A few seconds later, the door opened, and she stood. They're not startled, not flustered, just surprised. She looked like she hadn't expected me yet, like she'd lost track of time. Behind her, in the hallway, stood a man I had never seen before, but didn't need an introduction to recognize. He was her past. Clean shoes, well-fitted shirt, confident posture, easy smile. The kind of man who still expected doors to be held open for him just because they always had been. And she introduced us with this voice that sounded like it belonged. To a different version of her polite, polished, soft around the edges in a way she hadn't been in weeks. She said his name like it still tasted strange in her mouth, and he extended his hand like it was owed something. I didn't shake it. Not out of pettiness, out of clarity. I wasn't there to perform. I was there because I'd earned my place, because I knew who she was now, not who she used to be with him. She said they were just catching up. Said he'd stopped by unannounced. Said he wouldn't stay long. But her eyes didn't match the script. Her eyes were asking me not to make this harder, and so I didn't. I said I'd come back later.
No accusation.
No, wait, just a nod. And I turned and walked back to the truck with my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with fear. Not fear of losing her, fear of her losing herself. Because I knew what kind of power a ghost like that could have. Not because he was better, but because memory is deceptive, and comfort, even the kind that once hurt you, can sometimes wear a mask that looks like safety. I drove around for hours that day. Didn't go home, didn't go to work, just drove. Let the windows down. The wind tried to take the heat out of my chest. I kept seeing her face when she opened that door, how quickly she had shifted. Not into someone fake, but into someone practiced. It scared me how fast she could slip back into a role that wasn't hers anymore. She didn't call that night. I didn't expect her to. But the silence hit different this time. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like retreat. Like the space we'd built together had suddenly grown walls. Again, tall and freshly painted. I thought about what to say, whether to text, whether to show up the next day, whether to wait. But I knew that this was a moment she had to navigate on her own. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. It's on love. Real love knows when. To hold back the next day, she sent a message. Just 3 words. He's gone now. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to ask what he said, why he came, what it meant. But I didn't, because this wasn't about him. It was about her. Later that evening, she called. Her voice was steady, but there was exhaustion under it. The kind that doesn't come from physical labor, but from emotional excavation. She said he had shown up because he was passing through, like he said, that he wanted closure, that he wanted to explain after all these years that it hadn't been about her, that he had been lost, that he hadn't known how to be the man she needed. And she said that for a moment she believed him, that she let him talk, that she made coffee and sat across from him like it was a normal Tuesday. But then he started slipping little phrases, little jokes, little rewrites of the past that tried to make her complicit in his departure. She remembered. She remembered the years of doubt, of waiting, of hearing sorry said, like punctuation instead of apology. She remembered what it felt like to shrink just enough to make him feel tall. And she said she almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because she couldn't believe she had ever given that man her silence. And then she told him to leave, not angrily, not dramatically, just with finality. And when she shut the door behind him, she cried, not because she missed him, but because something in her had finally closed. That night, she asked if I could come by the next day, not to talk, just to be. And I did. I showed up early. I brought coffee. We sat on the porch in silence, and she leaned against me without needing to explain anything. We didn't discuss what he'd said or how it felt. Just sat there, to people who'd earned peace the hard way. And as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, she whispered the only thing I needed to hear. I didn't want to let him back. And I wanted to see if I still could. Now I don't have to anymore. The next time I saw her, the air had a kind of softness to it. It wasn't the weather, it was the atmosphere around the house. Something in the yard looked more relaxed, as if even the plants had noticed that whatever shadow had lingered the week before was finally gone. The gate was wide open this time, not just unlatched, and she was already on the porch waiting for me, not sitting with a book, not sipping tea, just standing there barefoot in an old t-shirt and a pair of jeans like she had nothing to prove, not to me and not to herself. Her hair was pulled back loosely and the sleeves of her shirt were rolled, and when she saw me, she didn't wave. She didn't move, she just smiled. And I knew before either of us said a word that we had made it through something. That the chapter we were in was no longer about repair, no longer about memory. It was about choosing to stay, now that we both knew exactly what the other person was carrying. We didn't start in the yard that day. She asked me to come inside, not because anything needed doing, not because there was a chore to check off. She just wanted company, and it didn't need a reason. Inside, the kitchen was lit with the soft yellow hue of late morning. Now, something was already baking bread maybe, or cinnamon. It smelled like warmth made tangible. She moved around the space with ease, not avoiding my eyes, not rushing through gestures. She poured 2 cups of coffee, handed me one without ceremony, and leaned against the counter like we did this every week. And maybe by now, we did. There was no tension, no uncertainty. Just the rhythm of 2 people who had stopped tiptoeing around the idea of each other and had started living inside it. She asked me to sit with her in the sunroom. It was a space I hadn't been in yet, small, with tall windows, and a couch that looked like it had caught every season of her solitude. There were plants on the sill, small and wild, not trimmed for display, but thriving in their own unruly way. She pulled the windows open, and the breeze filtered through like a quiet third guest. And we just sat there for a while, not talking, just existing in the same air. Every once in a while she'd glance at me, and I'd glance at her, but there was no urgency behind it. It was the kind of quiet that takes years to earn, the kind that doesn't ask questions, just offers presence. And then slowly, without announcing it, without shifting tone, she reached out and placed her hand on my knee. It was so gentle it might have gone unnoticed if it hadn't landed with the weight of everything we hadn't said. I looked at her. She looked at me. And that was it. She leaned forward slightly, not all at once, not like a decision had been made, but like gravity was finally allowed to do its job. And when our lips met, it didn't feel like a first kiss. It felt like an answer. Like 2 stories that had wandered so far in separate directions had finally found the same page. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't perfect. It was real, soft and slow and filled with breath. Her hand moved to the side of my face, and mine rested on the small space just above her waist. Nothing frantic, nothing claimed, just held, just allowed. When we pulled back, we didn't rush to fill the air with words. We didn't laugh or pull away in embarrassment. We just stayed there, forehead to forehead, breathing. And in that space, I realized that this moment wasn't the culmination of all the ones before. It was simply the continuation. The next natural step of 2 people who had already chosen each other in 100 silent ways. We spent the rest of the afternoon like that, not tangled in romance but entwined in simplicity. She made lunch, and we ate it barefoot at the kitchen counter. We didn't talk about the kiss, not because we were avoiding it, but because it didn't need analysis. It had already spoken for itself. In the way she touched my shoulder when she passed behind me. In the way I poured her a second cup without asking. In the way she leaned into my side when we stood on the back porch watching the sky stretch. The yard looked different now. Not neater, not messier, just alive, just shared. She told me she hadn't thought it was possible to feel new again. That after 48, you stop expecting those flutters. Those small magnetic pulls that feel like magic and truth combined, but they were there now. It's not because she had tried to summon them, but because we'd built something honest enough to let them grow on their own. When I left that evening, I didn't feel like I was leaving. I felt like I was stepping out for a moment, like a pause, not an exit. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her smile so familiar now, it felt like home. I kissed her again, soft and slow, and this time, we didn't pull apart as if unsure. This time, we stayed close, quiet. And when I finally walked down the steps, I looked back once not out of doubt, but reverence. Reverence for what we had managed to grow from brokenness. For the slow bloom of trust. For the kind of love that doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with open gates and hands that no longer shake when they reach out. And I knew, as the sky darkened and the streetlights flickered on, that we were no longer circling the edge of something fragile. We were inside it. Living it. Choosing it. One ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. The week after we kissed, nothing about the world looked different, but everything in me had changed. The road to her house was the same, with its crooked mailboxes and sagging fences, the same neighbors, watering their hedges or collecting garbage bins, the same squeaky gate hinge that had never been fixed. But as I stepped through it this time, something in me had softened, as if my body knew I wasn't walking into someone else's life anymore. I was walking into something that now included me. She met me in the kitchen, No porch this time. No tea or invitation waiting. It's just her, barefoot again, hair messy, eyes clear. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that doesn't try to seduce or impress, just says, "I'm glad you're here." And I was. I was glad to be there more than I could say. We didn't talk about what we were. There was no conversation about defining it. No checklist to run through. No promises whispered like contracts. But everything we did from that point forward said we both knew. When she handed me my coffee that morning, she touched my wrist a second longer than necessary. When I brushed the hair from her face later that day, she leaned into my hand without flinching. When we worked in the yard, we did it closer together now, often without needing to speak. She'd rake while I clipped hedges, and sometimes she'd reach out and hand me something before I even asked. It was like we'd tuned ourselves to the same frequency, where silence wasn't absence, it was acknowledgement. There was no performing, no needing to earn each other. We were just showing up, staying on. And in that simplicity, I felt safer than I had in years. Later in the afternoon, she asked if I wanted to help her clear the attic. It was a task she'd been avoiding for years, something too heavy to face alone. I followed her up the stairs, through a narrow door at the end of the hallway, and into a room that smelled like dust and forgotten time. The boxes were stacked in uneven towers, old blankets thrown over some, corners torn from others, handwritten labels faded to nearly nothing. She stood in the middle of it all, arms crossed, looking not at the clutter, but at the weight of it. I could tell this was more than spring cleaning. This was excavation. This was letting go. We worked slowly, gently opening boxes, like we were afraid of waking ghosts. Most of it was benign old curtains, outdated electronics, a pile of books she'd meant to donate years ago. But then she pulled open a box filled with photo albums, and I saw her hesitate. She sat down on an old trunk, flipped one open, and began turning pages like she was peeling back layers of herself. Childhood birthdays. Her parents, long gone. Vacations from another life. A picture of her holding her son as a baby, eyes tired but glowing. It's a photo of her ex, arm around her at what must have been a wedding. Her face in that one looked younger, but more strained, like she was smiling with teeth and not her eyes. She stared at that photo for a long time, then set it aside, closed the album, and looked at me. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. I just sat beside her and placed my hand on her back. We didn't need to dig further than that. Some things don't need commentary. They just need company. 8. We didn't finish the attic that day. We didn't try to. We just sat there, dust in our hair, time folding in around us. Two people not running from the past, but not dragging it forward either that night. I didn't leave right away. She asked me to stay for dinner again, and I did. This time, we cooked. Together, she handed me the knife to chop onions, teased me about my uneven slices, then leaned against the counter and laughed when I almost knocked over the salt. It was light, effortless, easy in the way nothing had been in the beginning. After we ate, she lit the candle again, always the same one, and we sat on the couch with music playing quietly in the background. No movies, no distractions, just us, sharing a space we'd both once filled with silence. She curled her legs under her and leaned into me like it was the most natural thing in the world, and maybe now it was. I rested my hand on her thigh, and she placed hers over mine. Ow. There. Was no rush to move, no pressure to escalate. We weren't chasing anything anymore. We were just in it, holding space for each other, slowly learning how to live in the comfort of being wanted, not needed. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the door as always, but this time she didn't stop at the frame. Outside with me, barefoot on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. I kissed her against lower this time, longer, and when we pulled away, she whispered thank you, not as gratitude for the gesture, but for everything, for the attic, for the silence, for the way I hadn't asked her to be anything more than exactly who she was. I touched her cheek, told her I'd see her Thursday instead of Tuesday. She nodded. No questions, no worry, just trust. As I drove away, I thought about how we got here, not with declarations or grand gestures, but with consistent presence. with 100 small yeses in moments where saying nothing would have been easier. This was what real love looked like, I realized. Not loud, not fast, but true. It grew in places most people never looked. And now that it had roots, I knew it wasn't going anywhere. The following Thursday started with a phone call I hadn't expected and couldn't ignore. It came from a friend I hadn't heard from in almost a year, someone I'd once worked with, someone who owed me nothing but remembered who I was when something big came across their desk. The offer was clear. A contract gig out of state. 3 months, good pay. The kind of job that wasn't just a paycheck but a foothold. Something stable, something forward-moving, something that could help me clear the last of my debts and maybe finally get off the hamster wheel of month-to-month living. It wasn't glamorous, but it was substantial. It's the kind of thing you say yes to when you've been saying just getting by for too long. I said I'd think about it, hung up and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, running. Numbers in my head like that would somehow make the decision easier. But numbers weren't the real variable. She was. By the time I got to Meredith's, I was carrying something I hadn't yet figured out how to put down. The weight of a future I hadn't planned to want. She met me at the door with her usual softness, kissed me on the cheek, and pulled me inside without asking if anything was wrong. Maybe she didn't notice, or maybe she did and just wanted to give me space to bring it up on my own. We moved through the day like usual, made lunch, worked on a few small projects in the yard. She talked about maybe repainting the fence before winter, about planting bulbs soon for next spring. Her voice was calm, her body was relaxed. But all I could hear in the back of my mind was the ticking of a clock that hadn't even started yet, and for the first time in weeks, I found myself guarding my silence, not sharing it. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I was afraid of what the truth might mean. Late in the afternoon, we sat on the back steps with our mugs, watching the leaves scatter like thoughts we couldn't hold on to. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I rested my chin on hers. We didn't speak, but I knew I couldn't keep holding it in. I told her about the job, about the 3 months, about the state line, about the offer I didn't go looking for, but somehow still landed on my lap. I told her I hadn't said yes, not yet, but I also hadn't said no. And then I waited. I waited for her to shift, to stiffen, to pull away, and begin bracing for the ending. But she didn't. She stayed where she was. She stayed silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't shake. She said, 3 months wasn't a lifetime. She said she wouldn't ask me to stay. She also wouldn't pretend. It wouldn't hurt. That it wouldn't be strange to return to silence after all this time of being seen. It would feel like learning how to breathe without music in the room. But she said I had to go if it was right. She said it with a strength I hadn't expected, a sadness I didn't want to hear. We didn't talk much more after that. I stayed for dinner, but the rhythm was different. Slower. Not broken, but tender. Like we were both touching something we didn't want to bruise. When I left that night, she hugged me tighter than usual. I felt her fingers press into my back like she was trying to remember the shape of me, just in case. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I called the guy back and said I needed a couple days. He understood. Said the spot was mine if I wanted it, but they couldn't wait past Monday. That gave me 4 days. 4 days to figure out whether a few months away would build something or unravel it. And every time I tried to imagine leaving, I could feel her porch steps under my feet, hear her laugh in the kitchen. Remember the way she touched my face with a steadiness that didn't ask for anything back? I went back on Saturday. She was in the attic of all places, sorting through the last few boxes. She told me she wanted to finish what we'd started, that no matter what I decided, she didn't want to leave it half done. We worked quietly, more focused than usual. It felt like we were both trying to complete something, to wrap it up neatly before something unraveled. When we finished, we sat on the attic floor, dusty and tired, and she handed me a photograph she'd found. It was one of her as a teenager, hair wild, eyes fierce. She said she used to be that girl. Then she said she felt like that girl. Again, lately not because of me, but because she remembered how to want things, how to fight for herself, how to be alone without being lonely. She said that no matter what happened next, she was grateful. And I didn't know what to say, because what do you say when someone hands you something that fragile and that heavy at the same time? That night, I drove back to my place and sat at the kitchen table for hours. I didn't pack. I didn't make a list. I just thought about what mattered. Thought about what it meant to build a life versus just move through one. Thought about her hands in the dirt, her letters, the way she made soup with the windows open. I thought about how love isn't always about holding on tightly. Sometimes it's about trusting that what you've built can hold shape even across distance. That the person on the other side of it won't disappear the second you step away. And then I thought about how rare it is to find someone who makes you feel seen without performance. And how foolish it would be to treat that as anything less than sacred. I went to bed without deciding, but I slept better than I expected. Because I knew whatever came next, it would be honest. Sunday morning came slow, wrapped in that kind of pale gray light that doesn't ask you to rush. I sat at the table again, same coffee, same silence, but the weight in my chest felt clearer. Not lighter, not gone, just organized. As if all the doubt had settled into categories now, and I could finally see the difference between fear and truth. I thought about the job again, the one that would take me out of the state for 3 months. A job that would change my finances, maybe my future. Maybe reset the years I'd spent just treading water. But all I could see was her kitchen, her porch, the way her hand curved around a coffee cup like she was holding something worth protecting. I thought about what it would mean to leave that rhythm behind, even temporarily. It's not because I didn't trust it, but because I finally understood the cost of having something good. It isn't in the price of keeping it. It's in the risk of walking away. By late afternoon, I was in the truck heading to her place. I hadn't texted. I didn't want to announce the moment. I didn't want her to prepare for it. I wanted to arrive as I had from the beginning, showing up, honest, uncertain, but all in. When I pulled up, she was outside. Not gardening, not sweeping, just sitting on the edge of the porch steps, elbows on her knees, looking out across the yard like it was talking to her. She saw me coming and didn't move. Not out of coldness, but out of knowing. She looked at me like she already understood that something had shifted. I sat down next to her without a word. Our shoulders touched. No small talk, no preamble. Just two people sitting in the quiet, like we always had when the words hadn't caught up to the weight yet. Then I told her I wasn't going to take the job. Not because it wasn't good. Not because I was afraid. But because, for the first time in my life, I had something better than progress. I had peace. And I wasn't willing to trade that for a check with a bigger number on it. She didn't speak right away. Her breath caught just a little, just enough for me to feel it ripple through her body. She asked me if I was sure. I told her no, not completely, but that I was clear. And sometimes, clear matters more than sure. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there like that for a while, watching the sun drop through the trees, painting everything in gold like a benediction. Told her I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it for me. For the first time, I liked who I was when I was with her. I liked the quiet. I liked the smallness of it all. I liked building something without a blueprint. And I liked that she never asked me to become anything I wasn't. She just made room. And I wanted to keep showing up for that, not later. Now, that night, we made dinner together again. Nothing fancy. Just pasta and garlic bread and a bottle of wine she'd forgotten she had. The windows were open, the music was low, and the entire house felt like it was breathing with us. Didn't need to talk about the job anymore. It had already passed through us. What remained was simple. This was our life now. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a decision made on a Sunday in a house that smelled like roasted tomatoes and thyme, with our feet bare on the hardwood floor. After we ate, she lit the candle like always, and we curled into the couch, this time not side by side but wrapped together, limbs folded, her head resting on my chest. My arm around her shoulders like a question I'd stopped needing an answer. 2. She told me then that she hadn't felt this kind of steadiness in decades, that she used to think love was a thing you proved through drama, or sacrifice, or grand gestures. But now she realized it was what you chose in the quiet. Who you made soup with, who saw your attic, didn't flinch when you showed them. Your broken parts. She said she didn't need fireworks. She just needed someone who didn't leave when the day turned messy. I kissed her forehead, and she traced small circles on my arm with her fingers, and I knew that this was it. Not the end of the story, but the real beginning. The job offer expired the next morning. I didn't call to decline. I let the clock run out. There was nothing to explain. I'd made my choice, not because it was safe, but because it was solid. Because I'd finally stopped measuring my worth by how far I could run, how high I could climb. And instead, I started measuring it by who I became when I stood still and looked someone in the eye without flinching. Meredith never asked me to stay, but everything about her made it possible to want to. And in the end, that was more than enough. That was everything. The morning after the job offer expired, I woke up earlier than usual. It's not because I had anywhere to be, but because my body had finally stopped holding tension in its sleep. The sun filtered through the blinds in long, soft lines, and I sat on the edge of the bed, just listening to the silence, that rare kind that doesn't feel empty, but earned. My phone was still dark. No calls, no texts, no urgency clawing for my time, just a day that belonged entirely to me. I knew where I wanted to spend it. I didn't shower. I didn't change. I just threw on yesterday's flannel and jeans, ran a hand through my hair, and got in the truck. The drive to Meredith's was familiar now, but it never felt routine. It felt like arriving. And when I pulled up in front of her house, something about the way the curtains were pulled open. The porch chair turned slightly inward, the empty coffee mug beside the potted rosemary, it all told me she was already awake, already watching the day unfold, already waiting for whatever came next. I stepped through the gate, and the wind rustled the trees, just enough to feel like a greeting. She wasn't on the porch this time. I found her in the backyard, barefoot, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, wearing one of those soft old sweatshirts that people only keep when they belong to memory. She was watering the flower bed by hand, a small blue metal can in her grip, moving slowly like she had nowhere else to be, like this was the whole point of the morning. She didn't startle when she heard me. She didn't look surprised. She just glanced over her shoulder, smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world, and kept watering. I walked up beside her, reached for the second can without asking, and joined her in the rhythm. No talking, no rush. Just two people tending to something that had taken root in the quiet. When the watering was done, she set the can down and took my hand. We walked over to the bench beneath the tree we'd sat under the very first time this had started to become something more than routine. The same old wooden bench with the chipped paint and uneven legs, only now it didn't feel forgotten. It felt sacred. She sat first, pulled her legs up beneath her, and I joined her, resting my arm behind her shoulders like I'd done it 1,000 times. And we just sat. Birds calling in the distance, breeze moving through the leaves above us, the smell of soil and sun on grass. This wasn't the kind of love you hear about in movies. It wasn't fiery or reckless or bursting with declarations. It was the kind you build slowly, one Tuesday at a time. One shared silence, one pulled weed, one old photograph held between two hands. She asked me if I was happy, not in a way that demanded reassurance, but in a way that asked if I'd actually let myself feel it. I took a moment, looked around, looked at her, looked at my hands, rough from work, but held gently in her lap now. And I said yes, because it was true. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I wasn't trying to earn love by being useful. I wasn't waiting for the next thing to make me feel worthy. I was already in it, chosen, seen, loved, not in spite of my stillness, but because of it. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I kissed the top of it. And we sat like that until the sun rose higher and the morning started to slip into afternoon. We made lunch together, both of us barefoot in the kitchen, music playing low, that same soft jazz station she always left on. And something about the way we moved passing utensils, brushing hips, refilling mugs, it felt like choreography, familiar and unspoken. When we ate, we didn't talk about the past or the future, just the food, the garden, the possibility of repainting the shutters before winter, and it felt like enough. More than enough. After lunch, she pulled out a drawer full of old candles and asked me to help her decide which ones to keep. We sat on the floor surrounded by wax and old scents and broken wicks, and it somehow became one of the most tender afternoons of my life. Before I left, she walked me out to the porch. This time, she didn't stop at the top of the stairs. She followed me down, walked with me to the truck, stood there, barefoot on the gravel, sun in her eyes, and reached for my hand. She said she didn't know how any of this happened, how something so quiet became so full. But she was grateful that this version of her, the one that laughed again, the one that asked questions and didn't flinch at answers, the one that opened the door instead of locking it, this version existed because I didn't run when the silence got heavy. I told her I never wanted her to be anyone else, that the version of her who hesitated was just as worthy as the one who smiled, that I didn't show up to save her. I showed up to stay. She kissed me again, slow and soft, like punctuation. It's like a period at the end of a sentence that didn't need rewriting. And when I got in the truck, I looked back once, saw her standing there in the same spot, arms folded gently, not waiting, not watching to see if I'd change my mind, just being just there. And I knew that whatever the rest of life looked like, however simple, however slow, would be enough. Because it would include her. Because it would be built the same way it began. In quiet, in honesty, in presence. I realized wasn't the thing that saved us. It was the thing that made being here worth it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.